10:20 a.m. on June 4th, 1942, the Empire of Japan was one step away from dominating the Pacific Ocean and forcing a total American surrender. By 10:30 a.m., the Empire was already doomed. 10 minutes. That was all it took for 3 precision-dropped bombs to turn the pride of the Imperial Navy into twisted metal and soaring walls of fire. It wasn't a lack of ammunition or a lack of courage. It was a tactical timing error that altered the course of human history forever. The Battle of Midway is often taught as a victory of naval intelligence, but inside the Japanese command rooms, it was a cascade of fatal hesitations. What was at stake wasn't just a small island in the middle of nowhere. It was global hegemony. Today, we dive into the minds of the commanders, break down the catastrophic failure in air defense doctrine, and discover how the most powerful naval force of its time collapsed under the weight of a single wrong decision made during the most high-pressure moment of World War II. Imagine the Pacific in June 1942. The Imperial Japanese Navy was not just a fleet, it was a force of nature. At the heart of this power was the Kido Butai, the first air fleet. 4 massive aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, sliced through the deep blue water like gods of war. Having devastated Pearl Harbor and swept through the Indian Ocean without defeat, their crews felt more than confident. They felt invincible. To them, the upcoming battle wasn't a risk. It was a funeral for the American Navy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's master plan was a masterpiece of complexity. By attacking a tiny coral atoll named Midway, he intended to lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive trap. The objective was absolute: wipe the US presence from the Pacific and force Washington to the negotiating table. But in the high-stakes game of naval warfare, absolute confidence is often the first step toward a massacre. As the sun climbed higher on June 4th, the Japanese fleet was a hive of lethal precision. Their first strike had already pummeled Midway, but the island's defenses were still standing. Just as Admiral Nagumo prepared a second strike to finish the job, a scout plane's report shattered the silence on the bridge. Enemy ships spotted. Suddenly, the perfect plan was dead. The invincible fleet was no longer the hunter, it was being hunted. Nagumo faced a brutal split-second dilemma: launch his bombers immediately with the land-shattering bombs they already carried, or wait and rearm them with torpedoes to sink the newly discovered American ships. He chose to wait. He chose perfection over speed. The choice was made, but the consequences were already descending from the clouds. Below the flight decks of the Akagi and Kaga, the atmosphere was one of controlled panic. Armorers worked frantically, swapping 800-kilo land bombs for aerial torpedoes. Steel clanged against steel as carts rattled across the hangars. This wasn't just a technical swap, it was a race against a clock the Japanese commanders couldn't even see. Every minute spent changing ordnance was a minute the Kido Butai sat as a massive stationary target, its most potent weapon, its aircraft, trapped inside the ship's belly. Then the horizon erupted. American torpedo bombers from the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown arrived first. They were uncoordinated and lacked fighter cover. For the Japanese anti-aircraft gunners and the elite Zero pilots, it looked like target practice. Wave after wave of American TBD Devastators were slaughtered, shredded by the Type 96 cannons and the superior maneuverability of the Japanese fighters. To Admiral Nagumo, it seemed his luck was holding. The Americans were desperate, fragmented, and failing. But this failure was the ultimate unintentional diversion. While the Japanese Zeros were drawn down to sea level to massacre the low-flying torpedo planes, the sky above was left wide open. The Japanese lookouts were focused on the surface, blinded by their own tactical success. They didn't see the SBD Dauntless dive bombers orbiting at 14,000 feet, banking into their final approach. The Japanese flight decks were now a forest of fueled planes, stacked bombs, and high-octane gasoline hoses, a literal powder keg waiting for a single spark. The silence at the peak of the dive was about to be broken by the roar of the end. At precisely 10:22 a.m., the trap was sprung, but not by the Japanese. High above the Kido Butai, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey spotted the white wake of a Japanese destroyer leading him straight to the main fleet. He looked down and saw a sight no pilot had ever seen: 4 massive carriers, vulnerable and exposed. There was no fighter cover at high altitude. The Zeros were busy elsewhere. McCluskey's dive bombers tipped their noses over. This was the deadly 10 minutes. On the decks of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the Japanese were just minutes away from launching their own counterstrike. strike. If they had had 5 more minutes, their planes would have been in the air. Instead, they were sitting ducks. The first bomb struck the Kaga. It didn't just hit the ship, it pierced through the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, where fueled planes and loose torpedoes were stacked like cordwood. The result wasn't just an explosion, it was a volcanic eruption of secondary detonations. On the Akagi, a single 1,000-pound bomb from Lieutenant Commander Richard Best struck near the amidships elevator. It was a surgical strike that doomed the flagship, the fire curtains failed, and the gasoline hoses became flamethrowers, feeding a fire that could not be extinguished. In less than 5 minutes, the backbone of the Imperial Japanese Navy was transformed into a series of floating infernos. The transition from supreme confidence to utter catastrophe was so fast that many officers on the bridges stood in silent, paralyzed shock. The world's most powerful naval air force had been decapitated in the time it takes to brew a cup of coffee. But while 3 giants were burning, one remained, and she was preparing a terrifying retaliation. The Hiryu stood alone, a cornered predator with its teeth still sharp. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, known for his aggressive spirit, didn't wait for permission to act. While the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were being consumed by uncontrollable infernos, Yamaguchi launched his remaining planes. This wasn't just a counterattack, it was a desperate strike for survival. His pilots followed the American bombers back to their source, the USS Yorktown. The Japanese struck with a ferocity born of vengeance. Twice they crippled the Yorktown. The American crew performed miracles of engineering, patching the flight deck and restarting the engines so quickly that when the second Japanese wave arrived, they thought they were attacking a fresh, undamaged carrier. But the Yorktown could only take so much. Eventually, she was abandoned, listing heavily into the sea. For a brief moment, it seemed Japan might salvage a draw from the jaws of a massacre, but the window of opportunity had already slammed shut. By late afternoon, scouts from the USS Enterprise located the Hiryu. A final crushing wave of SBD Dauntless bombers plummeted from the sun, 4 direct hits. The Hiryu's forward flight deck was blown upward, shielding the bridge like a massive steel tombstone. As the sun began to set over the Pacific, the realization set in: the heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy was dead. In less than 24 hours, the strategic map of the world had been redrawn in blood and oil. The transition from undisputed masters of the ocean to a retreating force was now complete. The flames eventually died down, but the smoke from Midway would haunt the Japanese high command until the very end of the war. The 10-minute error at Midway remains the ultimate lesson in military history, that in the age of modern warfare, the distance between total victory and absolute annihilation is measured not in miles or battalions, but in the seconds it takes to make a single and hesitant decision. If you want to see more deep dives into the strategies that changed the world, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. What other butterfly effect moments in military history should we cover? Let us know in the comments below. See you on the next battlefield.